Welcome, Dr. Battaglia. We're so honored to have you here today with us.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. It's such a pleasure and an honor and really a privilege to be here. I'm humbled.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll dive right in.
Yeah, let's get to
I
it.
think one of the questions that a lot of people are going to have is, what does it look like? What does mental health look like in the school systems, in special education? What exactly encompasses special education services?
Sure. I mean, that's like such a big and multi-layered
Mhm.
question. And I want to begin by saying I am not a mental health professional. And the reason why I say that is because I'm still trying to figure this out every day. And that's really important because I feel like I have so much to learn. So I go to my trusted professionals, you obviously being one of them. So thank you
Thank you.
always. But really, I guess we can just begin by describing my role as the chair of the Committee on Special Education. Now, I will say from state to state, there are some subtle nuances, but in the United States, these mandates are guided by federal law, which would be the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA, as well as FAPE, which is ensuring that all learners have access to free and appropriate
Mhm.
education. So I just want to begin
Mhm.
there. That being said, my role in special education is really to look at a scholar and determine if this individual has a disability or not. And that's a heavy weight because, on the one hand, as a provider, I want this child to have a disability because then that disability opens the gates to
Mhm.
services,
Mhm.
right? But on the other hand, as a parent
Yeah.
and as a human, we want all of our learners to be supported and to essentially be
Right.
okay,
Right.
right? So I feel like I'm always in this
Mhm.
place,
Mhm.
right? I just want to say that the education system, particularly the special education system, is one that is reactive. And that's a
Mm,
problem
mm,
in and of itself.
mhm.
So, in other words, I have to have before me evidence of failure, of some sort of failure, in order to determine if a child has a disability or
Mhm.
not. And there are a variety of reasons for that. We could have a whole separate podcast just about
Right,
pedagogy,
right.
right? And some of it is really founded in ensuring that this student has been supported thus
Mhm.
far. So we want to make sure that there have been attempts,
Right.
right? But that being said, by the time they get to me, a student is really in disarray if they truly do have a
Mm.
disability.
So, how are special education services within the school systems evolving to meet the current needs? What does that look like?
So I appreciate that. I was actually thinking about this. I will say that special education is certainly in a better place than it was 20 years ago, in that we now no more authentically appreciate social emotional learning.
Mm.
And we do truly consider mental health
Mhm.
issues. Again, just going back to my role under federal law, to have a student classified as a student with a disability, they have to fall under one of the 13 educational classifications, right? So speech or language impairment is one, autism is one, orthopedic impairment
Mhm.
is one, hearing
Yeah.
impairment is one, and emotional disabilities is also
Mhm.
one,
Mhm.
right? So what we are seeing is a rise in educational classification of emotional disabilities, right? So while we're not happy to see
Yeah.
that, right, as people, I'm happy to see that because it better encompasses what this child's struggles
Right.
are.
Right. Are you seeing that increase because now there's more awareness towards it, or is it because there's just consistent rising problems that contribute to mental health
Yeah.
and mental health distress?
I mean, I think it's six of one and half a dozen of the other. I don't know of any research that explicitly looks at that because the variables are so
Sure,
confounded.
sure.
I do think that there is more of an awareness
Hmm.
now. I do think that school districts at large are really making efforts to offer students with
Hmm.
services before they get to a
Hmm.
referral, which those are the things that I ask. When a student comes before me and we hold what's called a CSE meeting, I will look to the direct providers and say, well, what supports have been in place thus
Right.
far?
Right.
Because if the answer is none, I can't classify this child,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we need to know that attempts have been
Right.
made. And the reason why I'm saying this is because more and more the response is, well, this child has been to me once a week for non-mandated counseling.
Okay.
So I'm happy about that. I do see more resources being allocated for students who are not
Uh-huh.
classified. This is a conversation that is very much aligned to response to intervention on a national
Mm-hmm.
level. Again, a separate conversation, but very
Yeah.
aligned,
Yeah.
right? Because for a child to go from no services to pull out services with a classification, there has to be some sort of something that happened in between.
Mm-hmm.
So I am seeing that schools are responding to needs more readily and without classification, which is good because that makes my role easier, for lack of a better word, because then I can say, okay, so we've seen these supports are in place, they're
Mm-hmm.
ineffective. These supports are in place, they're ineffective. So how can we now move forward and further support this
Right.
child?
Right. So, what
Yeah.
does it look like? What's the process that families need to undergo or do undergo to secure these educational services, essentially clinical services for their
Right.
children?
First, I want to encourage families. Family empowerment is a part of my role, that no one is doing a family or a child a favor, that these are their rights. Okay. So let's begin at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning. So it depends on the age of the
Mm-hmm.
child, right? So if the child is from 0 to 3, that falls, and I'm speaking from reference of New York
Mm-hmm.
State, that falls within the county jurisdiction. So you would have to call your county office of mental health or public health, depending on how they
Mm-hmm.
call it. In which case, if the child is classified with a disability, they would have what's called an
Mm-hmm.
IFSP, which is an individualized family service
Right.
plan, which is really
Right.
wonderful, right? Because you're not just working with the child, you're working with their
Right.
family.
Right.
There seems to be a little bit of a disconnect from that transition to the
Mm-hmm.
school, where then it goes from the IFSP to what's called the
Yep.
IEP, which is the individualized educational plan. And somehow the family component inadvertently gets lost
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
The good news is that we are able to offer parent counseling and training to families within the scope of the IEP. It's just not called an
Right.
IFSP.
Right. Right. Gotcha. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, and I
So,
think the
yeah.
service.
So I just want to finish my
Sure.
thought. So from zero to
Mm-hmm.
three, the jurisdiction falls within the county lines, so to speak. And then from 3 to 21, you would go to your district of residence. You would go to their central office and say, I have a concern about my child. And they would give you a packet to fill out. You would complete this packet. And then evaluations would be conducted at that point, and then there would be a CSE
Mm-hmm.
meeting. Now, up until this point, I've really been talking about maybe older
Mm-hmm.
children, right, who have had a
Mm-hmm.
history. But sometimes we get a 3-year-old in the CPSE system, the Committee on Preschool Special Education, who just arrived to this country and we have no records, but the mom is concerned or the guardian is concerned. The same process
Mm-hmm.
applies.
Yeah, no, that's great. How does it look now we're at that place of getting services, right? How do those
Right. Okay.
services cater to students with mental health challenges, and what's the process to customize them to each child's needs?
That's a big question and it's a vague answer,
Right.
really. The reason why is not with
Mm-hmm.
intention, but because it really depends on each
Mm-hmm.
student, right? So when we think about mental health, and again, I'm not a mental health professional, but it varies, right? It could be, and please correct me if I'm wrong in anything that I'm saying, but you could have mental health issues that are organic,
Mm-hmm.
that are genetically
Mm-hmm.
predisposed.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can have mental health issues that are secondary to trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the behaviors manifest the
Mm-hmm.
same, sometimes they don't. And trauma is insidious.
Yes.
We don't know the trauma. Sometimes families don't know the
Mm-hmm.
trauma. They just know that they're looking at behaviors before them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that would happen, the first line of defense, so to speak, would be to mandate the child to go to counseling. And depending on the need, whether it's dealing with overt behaviors, whether it's dealing with regulation, It also depends on the age. It also depends on
Mm-hmm.
compliance, right? We also communicate with our families to find out if the student is already in outside counseling and if the student is already engaged in medication management.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's really important just to be aware of. We are not able to engage in medication management, but it is really an important set of variables to be aware of, right? So, because what happens is then we ask for consent for the providers to collaborate. And sometimes the student doesn't want that, right? So I think the answer really is that you have to listen to the student. And when I say listen to, it may not be with words.
Yeah.
Right? So, we have to monitor behaviors. We have to look at, as we move into adolescence and young adulthood, are they making healthy, safe choices? Are they engaging in risky behavior? Are they engaging in self-harm? What is the level of behavior that we're looking at? Because then we have to consider things like frequency and duration, right? I'm sorry, frequency and intensity. So behavior only has to happen once for it to be intense. But it could also happen many times and not be of high intensity. Okay. So it's all of these factors put in place. But the first line of defense is to recommend counseling and then to be in contact with the counselor to find out, is this effective? Because if the student's not going, it's not effective. Right? The student has will, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, if the student is willing and engaged, they will benefit. But there might also be maybe a better therapy that needs to happen for a student.
So in the situations where students are non-compliant, what ends up happening?
We meet with the student. And I met with a student yesterday who's engaging in school refusal and basically just refusal. Even when he's in school, he's just like shut down, completely shut down. I asked him, I said, can you just tell me where you are?
Yeah.
Like authentically, where are you? What are you doing? I really need to understand because I can't help you if you don't tell me. He wouldn't answer me. Now, here's the thing. He may not have answered me because there's an inherent power differential. He may not have answered me because he's ashamed. He may not have answered me because he's an adolescent and he hates adults. Right? It may have been all of these things. In that moment, I can't figure that out. To be honest. So what I did after the meeting was I spoke to the psychologist and I said, listen, if we don't get some hard and fast answers within a week, we need to get CPS over to that house because I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not within the purview of the CSE to call CPS, but it is within the purview of the school.
Sure.
And our psychologists are very committed. They make home visits on the regular.
Yeah.
On the regular.
I think families don't realize that that type of outreach and support is available to them, so I mean, I'm excited, just tangent, but I'm excited that we're even talking about this to shed light on that. But I think if you had one thing to say to families, to children, to kids, adolescents, anybody who might be listening who may need those services in school or through school because they're limited, what would you say to get them started?
Always call. Do not be afraid to call. Someone will help you. Always, always make that call. Because if you don't make that call, no one will ever know that you need help. And here's the other thing that I also tell people. This is kind of like my mantra because I've had some pushback from families and sometimes that's culturally driven, which you have to honor and respect. But what I have said to families is that in my 25 plus years of practice, I have never, ever seen a child die from an extra evaluation they may not have needed.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So true.
Or getting extra therapy that maybe they didn't need.
Right. I feel like that's 100% a great thing to say because society, shies away from the extra assessments, from getting the services. And to begin with, there's a stigma surrounding it. So to encourage more rather than less or not at all. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then the flip side of that too is, you may get to CSE and that child in question really doesn't qualify for services. That happens too. But if you don't make that phone call, no one will ever know.
Sure. Yeah. It's better to just find out. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's start talking about another big issue in the educational landscape, and that's substance abuse. Mm-hmm. Knowing that substance abuse is a factor, how do special ed programs adjust to support affected students and ensure that they also receive care and adequate education?
My answer is somewhat guarded because it always depends on the circumstance that we find out about the substance abuse. So what do I mean by that? A lot of times a student will get suspended for having some sort of contraband. That's when they go to a hearing and they will be put on home instruction as an out of school suspension, right? Now we can have a whole other conversation about out of school suspensions.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right? Like that's a whole, we don't have time.
Right.
I have very strong opinions about that. But for now, so a child usually will have an out of school suspension and then they'll have some sort of what's called a manifestation hearing. And their hearing will determine a few things. It will determine the conditions of reentry, and it will also determine whether the act in question was a direct result of the child's disability. So what happens is if a child is vaping in school, they get put on suspension, then they have a hearing to find out if the vaping was directly related to a diagnosis of ADHD. In which case, according to the state, it would be other health impairment, right? Most of the time it's not, but we still would hold a meeting to find out if any other supports need to be put in place. Now, the problem here is that educational systems in general are not equipped for addiction management. I don't know if that's the right word, but addressing addiction. Sure. The sad part about it is that in now my experience, you could see a trajectory. So what happens is, particularly it's been my experience in students with literacy disorders. So the cute little kindergartner who can't read suddenly becomes the 9th grader who is coming into school high every day in the blink of an eye because he really can't do the work. This is a student who's been identified, who has had supports attempted, but clearly failed. If I could live the dream, I know that we wanted to talk about this later, but if we could live the dream, it would be great to have intensive literacy support paired in a therapeutic environment. Because by 9th grade, now you're talking about Regents exams. You're talking about a child who can't write his name.
Stress, I mean, the stress of the grade.
Just the self-medication is almost necessary. Right. I know that that's not a very politically correct way to say it, but how is this child going to get by with no compensatory strategies? And again, I'm not saying that there have not been efforts, but it is a trajectory that you see this strong correlation between children with literacy disorders and then drug addiction early in high school. Because it's almost like the mentality is, and I'm making inferences from a collection of cases. I'm not saying it's one person or anything, that it's like, okay, I'm going to do my time for as long as I have to, and then I'm just going to drop out. But that scholar in that moment can't see the long-term effects of what those decisions are. They're just trying to get out of the now.
So we talk about potential solutions or what can be done, early intervention. What does it look like in that dream world? What would you have happen?
I just had a random thought. If I can just go back. And you said earlier, talking about mental health being on the rise. So for these students that I'm now seeing at the early high school level, we have to consider that they've really had very inconsistent education for multiple years.
That's a good point.
There was COVID. Some students went right back. Some schools went right back. Some went back hybrid. Some went back fully remote 2 years later, right? Then we have, in my school district, the middle school had a fire last year. Yeah, so it was closed for 3 months on
Wow.
remote through no fault of anyone. It could have been now, it could have been 10 years from
Mm-hmm.
now. But that confounded with COVID, we have a cohort of students who I could even say safely for 4 years really haven't had stable education. They've had attempts, they've had remote access, but they haven't had that community that you get early
Mm-hmm.
on.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have other mental health issues and you don't have that community, that's where risky behaviors come into play and things
Yeah.
like that. Last year, we had third graders who were sitting in a classroom full time for the first time because kindergarten is
Mm-hmm.
optional.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cultures, their families kept their children home by
Mm-hmm.
choice. And then first and second grade was COVID.
My goodness. Yeah.
So we have third graders who don't have any classroom readiness
Mm-hmm.
skills. So that's already anxiety
Right. And
provoking.
just to clarify, for those who may not know, can you summarize what classroom readiness skills are, what they look like?
Yes, thank
Mm-hmm.
you. Basically, I'm talking about what the life of a student is, possibly taking a bus, possibly being dropped off, standing in a line, exchanging pleasantries with persons of authority, as well as
Mm-hmm.
peers, literally unzipping a backpack, unzipping a jacket. There are students who don't know how to do
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Independently navigating, obtaining classroom materials, and getting started on independent work while you're waiting for the teacher to start the lesson. Then you have group work and lessons and centers and other kinds of active learning
Mm-hmm.
activities. So these third graders didn't have these
Mm-hmm.
skills, right? Through no fault of their
Right.
own.
Right.
So these are the kids that are now trying to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we have issues with mental health.
Right. So coming back to that other question, in
Yes, thank you.
of good,
Sorry.
no, it's great. This is so informative. What would happen in the dream world
Oh my
to
God.
be able to boost knowledge and support students who may have these difficulties early on? Early intervention is what I
Yeah.
mentioned.
I mean, I would love to see, and I'm biased, by the way. I would like to make that public service announcement. I'm completely biased, but I would love to see a world where a teacher has opportunities to collaborate with a literacy specialist and a speech language pathologist embedded in their day with counseling support. So you're talking about many professionals involved in a therapeutic
Well,
classroom.
and that's
Can you
yeah, oh
imagine?
yeah. I mean, and you're singing my song because like all I ever think about is how are we integrating all of these different components that can
Mhm.
essentially strengthen and enhance not only a sense of self-esteem and efficacy, but also knowledge, just basic knowledge to be
Right.
able to have, the skills that are needed to survive and
Yeah,
thrive.
that's
Yeah.
right. And that goes back to my commitment to interprofessional practice, but I hope every practitioner has that
Oh yeah.
commitment.
Yeah. 100%.
Or
100%. There are some pretty vulnerable populations that
oh
are
yeah.
all over, especially now, we've got a lot of things going on in this world.
Hmm.
How does trauma from arguably any difficult situation complicate access to special education for survivors who, of course, are going to be facing mental health issues? What are the support systems that are in place right now? And what are some maybe even examples, if you can share without.
Of course, I wouldn't share any confidential
Right.
information, but we are in a place right now, not to make this a political conversation, but we are dealing on the daily, and I mean this with all educational systems, by the way, just on a global scale, or I should say on a national scale, with newcomers arriving every day from the migrant
Yeah.
crisis. And we are also dealing with how to support individuals who are survivors from human trafficking. And these are deep issues. And by the way, these are issues that I do not feel equipped to
Mm-hmm.
address,
Mm-hmm.
right? And yet, here they
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
I do know that on the school level, there are many counselors who have formed newcomers groups
Mm-hmm.
who have really been very instrumental in supporting migrants who are newly
Mm-hmm.
arriving. from my perspective, remember my role is bird's eye
Sure.
view, right? So I don't have the opportunity to be in the schools on the day to day because I'm going from school to school or in central office, but people in my role, let's say, we have to consider what are the factors that newcomers are arriving under, right? So what does that mean? We have students who come to school who do not speak,
Yeah.
because they have been acculturated to not speak. So what happens? The teacher says, I've never heard his voice. He doesn't participate in class. I have no idea what's going on with this student, right? And this is not bashing teachers. Right. I'm outlining the conundrum. Yep. So it takes evaluation at the school level, and then they come to committee. And what we do to be culturally sensitive, first of all, we always work with translators. It's not a perfect system. I will say that, but we do the best we can. And then we have evaluations conducted in the child's native language as well as in English, because we're looking to see if there's a dominance. Sometimes the child really does not have a disability. But again, considering the circumstances of arrival at that point, then I would have to not classify the student and then send them back to the school for non-mandated counseling services. But there comes a tipping point where that service may be ineffective, right? And when that service is ineffective, then we have to say, well, is there a disability here? Which could be emotional, due to trauma, due to biology, genetics. So my point is, never ignore this crisis. Right. You know what they say about the starfish?
What do they say about the starfish?
You never heard that story? No. Oh my gosh, it's a poem.
Okay, now I got to hear it.
Yeah, I don't know it verbatim, but basically the story goes where there's a little boy on the beach, and I think it's a little boy, and there's thousands of starfish on the beach, thousands. And this little boy is taking each one and just throwing them in, throwing them back in. And then there's someone who comes up, an adult, and says, what are you doing? He said, I'm trying to save them. Yeah. And the adult says, well, there's so many here. What difference is it going to make? And the child picks up the starfish and throws it and says, it matters to this one.
Oh my goodness. What a beautiful story. I love it.
Now you have to look it up because I'm sure I botched it.
Oh yeah, that's a great one. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
I would love to take credit, but absolutely not.
Right. We're talking about bridging support, where people are coming from diverse backgrounds. They're facing not only trauma, but cultural issues and cultural, like predispositions. What do you think? Who else may be facing psychosocial challenges? How do you think we can bridge the gap in mental health support for students from diverse backgrounds who might have those additional psychosocial challenges?
We talked about migrants. We talked about human trafficking. Not that I enjoy talking about any of these things, but these are the realities, and we have to shed light, right? If we don't speak them into reality, it remains a silent crisis. I'm just trying, also sexual abuse, which is not that different than human trafficking, unfortunately. We've had many cases of female students, ridiculously young, painfully young, who have been victimized and who are trauma survivors. And unfortunately, sometimes what happens is, despite our best efforts, we're not able to support them properly. And when that happens, what we will do our best to do is engage with out-of-district partners. So we actually have two very therapeutic environments that we work with. And you know what's sad? They're filled.
Of course, that we run into that horrible problem across the nation and arguably the world, where the wait lists are never ending.
Yeah. And then in those cases, we have no choice but to place the student on home instruction. Right. Now, here's the thing. We've had some cases where that's wonderful. It actually worked out really, really well. The student didn't have issues of managing classes and multitasking. It was very individualized education. We have some top-notch retired teachers who are vibrant and committed, who do an amazing job, who are very seasoned, and they do well. But then we have other students who are in unsafe environments where that's not the answer. And I don't know what to tell you about that, because those are kids who we're working with the system, so to speak. They may be living in group homes. We will send our staff to group homes, but there's so much going on in these homes that it may not be a fruitful scenario. With the scenario of COVID, remote teaching has become more readily available. We do have funds to provide students who have unstable housing under what's called the McKinney-Vento Act. Give them actually supplies. We can get them Chromebook and a headset and a hotspot. In the past, we hadn't done hotspots, and then we realized that a Chromebook with no hotspot really was not helpful. And it didn't feel right to tell this child who's essentially homeless to go to Starbucks so that they could take class. Didn't feel right. So there are systems in place. I'm not going to say they're great, because in general, we really need to reconceptualize education for students with issues in mental health, really for all students, right? Because if you elevate one student, you're elevating all, if you take these intense approaches.
Absolutely. And the more that also helps with reinforcing that sense of awareness amongst the student population, so that they can find their own voices and say, I need help. Please help me. Yeah. So that actually takes us into the next question, which is resources and strategies. Like, what's available for families advocating for special education services that addresses both developmental and mental health needs for their children? And we've talked about some of them, but it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not an integrated system. We do have phenomenal counselors in-house, but when the need exceeds what our counselors can do within school, we work with families to refer them to community service providers. And our counselors are so committed, they will even set up the appointments. And we've had instances even where we set up transportation for families. That being said, that's not the norm. And it needs to be. So sometimes you have children who are limited. Sometimes their parents are limited. You have many instances of multi-generational mental health trauma. I had a scenario a few weeks back where I was working with a child who has severe cognitive and emotional, and he lives in a multi-generational home. Mom is very limited. Grandma calls the shots, and grandma doesn't necessarily support education or special education. So it's a thing, right? So that also brings us back to awareness, cultural responsiveness, denial. Denial is very powerful, and it manifests in many forms. There are many days where I'm not a favored person, like in the universe, right? For a variety of reasons, either because I want to offer services or because I can't offer services.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. No, it's a real struggle for sure. So if you could empower guardians and families and parents, what would you say? What would you do? What would you recommend to secure comprehensive support and services to support these mental health issues, addictions, educational needs?
Assuming, I'm making a very strong assumption that the child is willing, right? Because that's so critical in a recovery journey. I would say knock on every doorstep. Be persistent and knock on, because even the clinics are filled. But call, get someone's name, ask them, okay, you have a 4-month waiting list. I'm calling back in 4 months. Should I speak to you? Who should I speak to? Put my name on that list. Right? Don't just call like a softball. You want to be so persistent, because the system has created this need for people to be this persistent. There are so many gaps along the way that I would say knock on every doorstep and follow up, make connections, attend workshops, look at your local SEPTA group, which is the Special Education Parent Teacher Associations. Connect with people who have been through this. I mean, I could easily connect a parent, but I think when it is more organic from parent to parent, I think it's better received.
So communities for parents, like, are there resources and tools available for parents to be able to come together to support their children collectively, like essentially parent groups?
Yeah. What I have observed, so we do offer parent training, but it really is on an individual basis. It's really not based in community. There are some of our partners that do community groups. And also the local community centers I have found have offered such amazing, robust programs. Our local center is unbelievable. They offer all kinds of after school programs, and they offer all kinds of adult programs, regardless of one's religious affinity, whatever your religious group is. I'm finding that more and more of these religious groups are offering parent support. I know that's outside of the scope of education, but I get this question all the time.
Sure. Yeah. What resources, what tools are there? Yeah, for sure.
Like, if you're not able to help me, then who can?
Exactly.
Yeah. But bridging those community partnerships, I think in an ideal world, I think as an educational system, we're getting better at it, but we're not where we need to be.
Sure. What else is needed, would you say?
I mean, I would love to see seamless management. So what that would look like is access to a student's home provider, access to a psychiatrist with medication who's engaging in medication management, having a psychiatrist on staff in the building. So we do have partnerships with medical facilities, but again, they're separated because they're partnerships, and you have to make a separate set of appointments for these individuals. It would be amazing if everything were just seamless. I know that from the back end, administratively, it would probably be a nightmare, but the outcomes I really believe would be so much better than we're getting now.
Sure. That's amazing. This is amazing. Thank you for all of this insight. We always like to end our sessions by asking the question, what does recovery mean to you?
That's powerful. That is a big question. And for me, I believe, and I'm speaking for me, recovery is being okay in the very, very moment you're in and being where your feet are. And just being okay in that moment.
Beautiful. Love it.
Yeah. That's what recovery looks like to me.
What would you say recovery would look like for the kids and the families that you work with? Like, how would you define that?
I don't think I have the right to make that definition, but I do ask students when I have the opportunity, like, what would it look like for you to be okay? When you ask a child who's not in recovery that question, you don't always get a pleasant answer. Heads up. But, a world where I didn't have to deal with you. Right. Snarky responses.
Yeah, no, it's that moment. Like, I wish we never met, but I'm glad we did now.
Yes. But I'll say, like, 5 years down the road, what do you hope your life will look like? Where do you want to be? Do you still want to be in the home you're with the people you're around? Some people might say yes. Some people might say no. So I will ask them, like, I can't impose my belief on recovery to someone else because everyone's journey is different. But I will ask, where do you see yourself? And we do have a system in place within education where we have what's called an exit summary when a child is graduating. And, you have to actually do all of these assessments where the child is engaged in these assessments, right? So what does life after graduation look like? What are your goals and aspirations? So I think I would ask another question to that is, what does recovery look like for you as part of that exit summary?
Yeah. Absolutely. I love it. Such wonderful insights, Dr. Battaglia. Dina,
Thank you.
always a
Oh, it's been a
pleasure
pleasure.
to talk to you. And we'll definitely be in touch because there's so many other topics that we can talk about. So,
Yes.
thank you so much.
So
Thank
much.
you so much for coming.